Noticing a decline in service quality and a rising employee turnover rate, the owner of a fast food chain disguises himself as a regular customer to investigate. At one of his locations, he witnesses exhausted workers pushing through long hours without breaks, while the manager yells at them, belittles their efforts, and even fires them without cause. Realizing that the company's culture has strayed far from his original vision and is spiraling into something toxic, he makes a bold decision. It's time to take control and rebuild from the ground up. Mason Hayes sat in his office, staring at the latest round of customer complaints piling up in his inbox. Cold food, rude staff, orders taking too long, employees quitting without notice. The reports had been growing worse over the past few months, and while his regional managers assured him everything was under control, the numbers told a different story. Harvest Grill had been his pride and joy for over 15 years, a small but thriving chain of 15 family-friendly diners spread across the state. It wasn't just about food for him. It was about building a business where people felt welcome, where employees wanted to stay, and where customers knew they'd always be treated right. Lately, though, it felt like he was losing touch with that vision. He had built his company from nothing, fighting tooth and nail to succeed in an industry that wasn't always kind to men like him. He knew what it was like to be underestimated, to have to prove himself over and over. That was why he had always made sure his employees felt valued, because he remembered how it felt to work for someone who didn't care. But something had changed. The numbers weren't adding up. Reviews on social media painted a picture that didn't match the polished reports his managers were feeding him. And now, his gut was telling him something wasn't right. Mason leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as he weighed his next move. He could call another meeting, send another memo, demand another round of performance reviews. But he knew how that would go. His managers would nod, promise to handle it, and nothing would change. He needed to see it for himself. He needed to know, firsthand, what was happening inside his own business. His eyes fell on a report from a location in Brookhaven, a suburban town 2 hours away from the corporate office. The complaints there had been particularly troubling: slow service, high turnover, staff described as unfriendly or disinterested. It was far enough away that most of the employees had never seen him in person. Perfect. That night, Mason made a decision. If no one was going to give him the truth, he would go find it himself. The next morning, he left his penthouse in downtown Atlanta before sunrise. He dressed for anonymity, an old faded hoodie, worn jeans, sneakers that had seen better days. He let his beard grow in just enough to dull the sharp edges of his usually well-groomed appearance. A pair of thick-rimmed glasses completed the look. Gone was the polished executive who had his name on the company's website. No one would look twice at him now. As he drove, he thought about how different things were now compared to when he'd first started Harvest Grill. Back then, he had worked every job in the restaurant: line cook, server, dishwasher, even janitor when needed. He had built his business from the ground up, not by sitting in boardrooms, but by understanding every part of what made a diner run. He had been in the trenches with his people. Somewhere along the way, that had changed. 2 hours later, Mason pulled into the parking lot of the Brookhaven Harvest Grill. It looked like any other suburban diner: brick exterior, large windows, a faded neon sign flickering slightly. The lot was half full, a good sign for a late morning crowd, but something about the place felt off. He sat in his car for a moment, watching. A server rushed outside, head down, rubbing her temples before forcing a smile and stepping back inside. Through the windows he could see customers waiting at tables, some of them glancing at their watches impatiently. A man at the counter raised his hand, trying to get someone's attention, but the lone waitress in sight was already juggling 3 orders at once. Taking a deep breath, Mason stepped out of his car and walked inside. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but the atmosphere was tense. The booths were clean but worn, the floor scuffed from years of foot traffic. The walls were lined with framed photos of happy customers, at least that's what they were meant to represent. The energy in the room told a different story. A waitress approached, her name tag reading Brianna. She was young, mid-20s at most, with tired eyes and a ponytail that looked like it had been hastily thrown together at the start of a long shift. She forced a smile, the kind that barely reached her eyes. "Hi there. Welcome to Harvest Grill. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Mason could hear the exhaustion in her voice, see the faint shadows under her eyes. She was running on fumes. "Just coffee," he said, sliding into a booth near the window. Brianna nodded and hurried off, moving quickly between tables, balancing plates on one arm, refilling drinks, scribbling down orders without breaking stride. She was good, efficient, careful, never letting her frustration show. But she was clearly doing too much. Mason had seen it before. When a restaurant was understaffed, the best workers ended up bearing the brunt of it. As he waited for his coffee, he listened. At the booth behind him, a family was whispering about how long it was taking for their food. Across the room, an older man at the counter muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Then, from the kitchen, a voice boomed. "Brianna, what the hell is taking so long? You falling behind again?" The voice belonged to a man in his late 30s or early 40s, stocky, with a permanent scowl. His apron was stained, and the way he barked the words made the hairs on Mason's arms rise. He hadn't even introduced himself when Mason walked in, something that was already a red flag. Brianna flinched at the tone but called back quickly, her voice tight. "Coming right up." She turned back toward the counter, moving even faster now, almost stumbling as she grabbed plates. Mason frowned. This was not how his business was supposed to run. Brianna returned with his coffee, setting it down carefully. "Sorry about the wait," she said softly, eyes flicking downward. "No worries," Mason replied, offering her a small smile. "You're doing great." She hesitated for just a second, like she wasn't used to hearing that, then nodded quickly before hurrying off again. Mason had barely taken a sip when he heard muffled sobbing coming from the kitchen. He froze. The sound was unmistakable. It was Brianna. Setting his coffee down, he listened. "I'm trying my best, okay?" Her voice cracked through the thin walls. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." A sharp, dismissive voice cut through the air. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job. We don't have time for excuses." Mason's stomach turned. His fingers clenched around his coffee cup. This wasn't just a staffing issue. This was something deeper. And he wasn't about to sit by and let it continue. Mason's jaw tightened as the muffled sobs from the kitchen sent a slow, burning heat up his spine. He had heard enough. Setting his coffee down, he slid out of the booth, moving toward the swinging kitchen door. He didn't storm in. He wasn't here to make a scene just yet, but his steps were deliberate, his pulse steady despite the anger curling in his chest. He had seen bad management before, but hearing the raw exhaustion in Brianna's voice, the way she was breaking under the weight of her shift, that was something different. That was personal. He stepped just far enough past the threshold to see the scene unfold. Brianna stood near the prep station, hands trembling as she wiped at her damp cheeks with the back of her wrist. She wasn't crying anymore, but her eyes were red, her breath shallow as she tried to pull herself together. Across from her, arms folded over his chest, stood the man who had barked at her earlier, the shift manager, Anthony Carter. Anthony wasn't a large man, but he carried himself like someone who thrived on intimidation. He had the posture of a man who enjoyed power in small doses, who had long since stopped caring how his words landed as long as they got results. His lips curled in irritation as he glared down at Brianna. "I don't have time for your damn tears," he muttered, voice low but sharp. "You're not the only one working a double. You want to cry about it, do it on your own time." Brianna nodded quickly, swallowing hard as she grabbed a fresh plate from the line, her movements stiff and robotic. Mason took another step forward. "Is there a problem here?" Anthony turned, his face twisting into something between mild annoyance and vague curiosity. His eyes flicked over Mason's hoodie, his worn jeans, his thick-rimmed glasses. He clearly saw nothing but a customer, someone unimportant, and that worked in Mason's favor for now. "No problem," Anthony said flatly. Mason didn't buy that for a second. He glanced at Brianna, her face still pale, her hands gripping the plate a little too tightly. She wasn't fine, and she sure as hell wasn't okay, but she wouldn't say it. Not in front of Anthony. Not with her job on the line. Mason exhaled slowly, keeping his voice level. "She looks like she needs a break. Why don't you let her take 5? Anthony scoffed, shaking his head. "We don't have time for breaks during rush hours." "There's always time to treat people with respect," Mason countered. Anthony's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly, his scowl deepening. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by some random customer. Look, man, I don't know who you think you are, but this is none of your business. If she can't handle the heat, maybe she should find another job. Mason's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He forced himself to stay calm, but his patience was wearing thin. Before he could respond, a voice from the grill station cut in. She hasn't even had time to drink water. Mason turned to see Chris Evans, the kitchen's head cook. He was a lanky man with short, cropped hair, his apron already stained from the morning rush. He wasn't looking at Anthony, just flipping a burger, his voice carefully neutral. But there was a quiet defiance in the way he said it, a weight to his words that suggested this wasn't the first time he had witnessed something like this. Anthony shot him a glare. "Stay out of it, Chris. Focus on your station." Chris didn't respond, but the way his jaw tensed told Mason everything he needed to know. Mason turned his gaze back to Anthony, his voice still calm, but there was a sharpness underneath it now. "And who's in charge of making sure your team can actually function? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the pressure is coming from the way this place is being run." Anthony let out a dry, humorless chuckle, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he was having this conversation. "I do what I have to do to keep this place running. If people can't handle it, that's not on me." Mason's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." Brianna wiped her eyes one last time, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be fine," she muttered, though there was no real conviction behind it. She turned toward the door, clearly eager to escape the conversation. But Mason wasn't letting this go. He gently stopped her with a nod. "Take 5, he said, his voice softer this time. "You've earned it." Anthony opened his mouth to protest, but Mason held up a hand, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's taking a break. Now." A muscle in Anthony's jaw twitched, but he didn't push further. He just muttered something under his breath and turned back toward the kitchen. Brianna hesitated for a moment before giving Mason a small, grateful nod and slipping past the swinging doors. Mason let out a slow breath, watching as the tension in the room shifted, but not enough. The damage was already done. Anthony might have backed off for now, but the culture in this kitchen was toxic, and it had been allowed to fester for too long. He had seen enough. Turning back toward Anthony, he kept his voice level, but there was an edge to it now, a warning. "What's your name?" Anthony folded his arms. "Anthony." "And how long have you been the manager here?" 2 years. Mason nodded, processing that. 2 years was long enough to build a strong team, or to destroy one. Anthony let out a small, smug laugh. "Look, man, I don't know what your problem is, but I don't need some random guy off the street telling me how to do my job." Mason tilted his head, studying him. "And what exactly do you think your job is?" Anthony smirked. "Keeping this place running. Making sure we don't fall behind." Mason's gaze sharpened. "And you think this is how you do it? Running your staff into the ground, yelling at people in front of customers, making employees cry in the kitchen?" Anthony's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. "I do what I have to." Mason didn't blink. "If I were your boss, I'd say you're doing a pretty shitty job." Anthony let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Well, lucky for me, you're not my boss." Silence settled over the kitchen for half a second before Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Slowly, deliberately, he flipped it open, revealing the ID card with his name, photo, and title. Mason Hayes, CEO, Harvest Grill. The air in the kitchen shifted instantly. Anthony's smirk vanished so fast it was almost comical. His face paled, his posture stiffening as the realization crashed over him. Chris froze mid-motion at the grill, eyes widening slightly. Even the dishwasher, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Mason tucked his wallet back into his pocket, his voice calm but absolute. "I own this restaurant." His eyes never left Anthony's, and 13 others just like it. The kitchen was dead silent. Anthony opened his mouth, then closed it again, scrambling for words. But Mason had seen enough. "Let's talk," he said, motioning toward the office. Anthony hesitated, but he knew there was no getting out of it now. Stiffly, he turned and walked toward the back. Mason followed. Brianna re-entered the dining room just in time to watch her tormentor disappear into the office with the CEO of the entire company. And for the first time in months, she let herself hope that things were about to change. The office door clicked shut behind them, sealing Anthony inside with Mason. The room was small, cluttered, with papers scattered across the desk and an old, buzzing fluorescent light overhead. The scent of stale coffee and grease lingered in the air, mixing with the thick tension that had settled between them. Anthony stood stiffly by the desk, arms crossed, his face still pale but his jaw locked in defiance. He had gone from cocky to cautious in the span of minutes, but Mason could see it, the flicker of arrogance still clinging to him like a bad habit. He was scrambling, trying to figure out if there was a way to talk himself out of the hole he'd just fallen into. Mason, however, wasn't here for excuses. He took his time, stepping forward, pulling out the worn wooden chair across from the desk, and sitting down. He didn't rush. He let the silence settle, let it press down on Anthony, let the weight of what was happening sink in. Because now, Anthony knew who he was dealing with. For the first time since Mason had walked through the doors of this diner, Anthony no longer had control. "You want to tell me what the hell that was out there?" Mason's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the authority in it. He didn't need to yell to make himself heard. The weight of his words was enough. Anthony scoffed, shifting his stance, arms still crossed. "What do you mean?" "I was doing my job." Mason exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He studied Anthony for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said simply. "What I saw wasn't leadership. It wasn't management. It was bullying." Anthony's face twitched. "I wasn't." "You made a young woman cry in the middle of her shift." Mason cut him off, his voice sharp now. "You berated her in front of customers. You've created an environment where my employees are scared to even ask for a break. And instead of owning up to it, you're standing here pretending that's just part of the job. No, that's not how this works." Anthony scoffed again, this time with more frustration. "Look, I don't know what you expect. This isn't some fancy office job. It's a diner. Things move fast, and if people can't handle it, maybe they shouldn't be here. I don't have time to hold people's hands, all right? We're short-staffed. We're slammed half the time. And the ones who can't keep up are the ones making it harder for the rest of us." Mason's fingers curled into a fist on the desk, but he kept his composure. He had heard variations of this bullshit excuse before. Managers who thought breaking employees down would somehow make them work harder. He had zero patience for that mindset. "Let me ask you something," Mason said, his tone deceptively calm. "How long have you been the manager here?" Anthony straightened slightly. 2 years. "And in those 2 years," Mason continued, "how many employees have quit under your management?" Anthony hesitated, shifting his weight. "People leave all the time. It's food service." "That's not what I asked." Mason's voice hardened. "I asked how many." Anthony's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. Mason didn't need him to. "Because I checked before I came here," Mason continued, his voice low, controlled. "And the turnover rate at this location is higher than any other Harvest Grill in the state. That doesn't happen by accident." He let that sink in for a beat before adding, "And based on what I've seen today, I'd bet money that you're the reason why." Anthony's face reddened. "That's not fair." "What's not fair," Mason interrupted, his voice cold now, "is making employees feel like they're disposable. What's not fair is forcing them to pick up the slack because you don't know how to run a team. What's not fair is you treating them like garbage and then acting surprised when they walk out the door." Anthony's nostrils flared, but he had no defense. Mason shook his head. "Here's the reality. The staff at this location is overworked and undersupported. Customers are complaining. Employee morale is in the dirt. And the one person who's supposed to be fixing those problems is the same person making them worse." Anthony swallowed hard, his arms no longer crossed, his hands now clenched into fists at his sides. "Look, I get it," he muttered. "I could be better about how I talk to people, but firing me, that's overkill. I can fix this." "No," Mason said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You won't. Because you're done." Anthony's head snapped up. Wait, what? You're fired. Panic flashed across Anthony's face. You can't. I can, Mason said, dead serious, and I just did. Anthony stared at him, really processing it now. He wasn't just being scolded. He wasn't just getting a slap on the wrist. This was real. His entire sense of control over this place was gone. Mason let that moment stretch. He wanted Anthony to feel it. Then he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that every syllable hit with precision. I built this company on respect, on treating people like they matter. You don't fit into that. So pack your things and turn in your keys. You're done here. Anthony clenched his jaw, his body tense, as if debating whether to argue, whether to plead his case. But he must have seen the unshakable certainty in Mason's expression, because after a few seconds, his shoulders sagged in defeat. Fine, he muttered. Mason stood. I'll have HR process your severance package. But as of right now, you're no longer part of this company. Anthony didn't respond. He just turned stiffly and walked toward the door, every movement rigid, his pride clearly bruised beyond repair. As soon as he was gone, Mason exhaled slowly, pressing his palms against the desk for a moment. He didn't enjoy firing people. That wasn't why he built this company. But he wasn't about to let someone like that stay in charge of his employees. Straightening, he rolled his shoulders back and stepped out of the office. The second he walked back into the dining room, all eyes were on him. The cooks had gone quiet. Brianna stood frozen near the register. Chris wiped his hands on his apron, but was clearly listening intently. Even a few customers were watching, sensing the shift in energy. Mason let them wait for a beat before he spoke. Anthony's gone. His voice carried through the room, steady and firm. Things are going to change around here, starting today. He looked directly at Brianna and Chris. You two, meet me after your shift. We need to talk. The tension in the room shifted, the weight in the air eased. No one cheered, no one celebrated, but there was something different now, a flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Hope. Mason had no illusions that one conversation, one action, would fix everything overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like his company was heading back in the right direction. And he was just getting started. As the afternoon rush settled, Mason remained seated in a corner booth, arms folded, eyes scanning the restaurant like a battlefield commander surveying his troops. The energy in the diner had shifted, tentative but undeniable. Without Anthony's oppressive presence looming over them, the employees moved with a little less tension, their shoulders not as hunched, their steps not as hurried. The relief was there, but it was mixed with something else. Uncertainty. What happens now? That unspoken question hung in the air, in the way Brianna hesitated when handing off a check, in the way Chris cast glances toward the back as if expecting Anthony to storm out and reclaim his position. But Mason had made himself clear. That wasn't going to happen. When the last few customers finished their meals and the evening lull settled in, he pushed himself up from the booth, stretching his back before making his way toward the kitchen. Brianna was wiping down the counter, her movements precise but slower than before, exhaustion creeping in now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had faded. Chris stood at the grill, flipping the last few orders, his expression unreadable but his posture less rigid than it had been earlier. Mason caught Brianna's eye first. Got a minute? She nodded quickly, setting her rag down as she followed him toward an empty table near the front. Chris hesitated for a second, then wiped his hands on his apron and joined them, sliding into the seat across from Mason. The two employees sat with the stiffness of people unaccustomed to being called into meetings that didn't involve being reprimanded. Mason didn't speak right away. He let the silence breathe for a moment, letting them settle into the reality of what had happened today. Then, in a tone that was firm but without edge, he said, "Talk to me. What's really been going on here?" Brianna glanced at Chris first, as if checking whether she should speak. When Chris gave her a barely perceptible nod, she exhaled and looked back at Mason. "It's been bad," she admitted, her voice quieter now, stripped of the forced cheerfulness she used with customers. "For a while." Mason nodded for her to continue. She shifted slightly in her seat, fingers nervously tapping against the edge of the table. At first it wasn't like this. When I started, it was tough, yeah, but it was manageable. People cared. We had a solid crew. But then folks started quitting, one by one. And every time someone left, Anthony wouldn't replace them. He'd just tell the rest of us to suck it up and do more with less. She swallowed, shaking her head. It got worse every month. Every week. The stress, the way he talked to us like we were nothing, like we weren't even people. And we all knew we couldn't say anything, because if we did, she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. He'd make it worse. Chris finished for her, his voice even. Brianna nodded. Yeah, exactly. Mason absorbed that, jaw tightening slightly. He had suspected as much, but hearing it directly from them hit different. He had built this company to be a place of opportunity, not a place where people dreaded showing up to work. And the fact that this had been happening under his nose, that stung. Why didn't you leave? He asked after a moment, directing the question at both of them. Chris exhaled through his nose, rubbing the back of his neck. Thought about it, he admitted. Almost did. But he glanced at Brianna. Not everyone could afford to walk away, and someone had to hold the line. If I left, I knew it'd only get worse for her, for the others. Brianna's eyes darted to Chris, surprise flickering across her face, as if she hadn't realized until now that he had stayed for them. Mason took that in, respect settling into his gaze as he looked at Chris. That's leadership, he said simply. Chris blinked, clearly caught off guard by the statement, but Mason didn't let the moment linger. He turned back to Brianna. And you? She hesitated, then sighed. I needed the job, she admitted. But also, she glanced around the diner, at the empty tables, the now quiet kitchen. I loved this place. Or at least I loved what it was supposed to be. I liked the customers, the regulars, the way we used to joke around in the back before things got bad. I kept hoping, maybe something would change. She looked back at Mason now, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since they sat down. I didn't think it actually would. Mason exhaled slowly, letting their words settle, feeling the weight of them. Then, leaning forward slightly, he said, It is changing. Starting now. Neither of them spoke, but he could see the skepticism lingering behind their exhaustion. They'd been burned before. They weren't ready to trust that easily. Mason understood that. He tapped a finger against the table once, deliberate. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice steady. First, I'm bringing in a new manager. Someone who knows how to lead, not dictate. Someone who understands that the best teams are built on respect, not fear. Until I find that person, I'll be overseeing things here myself. Brianna's mouth parted slightly, her brow furrowing. Wait, you're staying? Mason nodded. For as long as it takes. Chris's expression shifted slightly, something like cautious approval flickering behind his tired gaze. Second, Mason continued, I'm fixing the staffing situation. No more being short-handed during peak hours. I'm hiring more people, effective immediately. And I'm making sure that every single employee gets the breaks they're supposed to have. No exceptions. A slow exhale of relief passed through Brianna's lips. Third, Mason's tone softened now, though the conviction in it didn't waver. You two have been holding this place together. I see that now, and it's time you get something for it. Chris frowned slightly. What do you mean? Mason turned to him first. You're the closest thing this place has had to a real leader. You stepped up when no one else would. That's why I'm promoting you to assistant manager. Chris froze. What? You heard me, Mason said, smirking slightly at the shock on his face. You've already been doing the work. Now you'll have the title to match. And a raise. Chris still looked like he wasn't entirely sure he had heard correctly, like he was waiting for some kind of catch. But when none came, his lips parted slightly in genuine disbelief. I don't know what to say. Say you'll take the job, Mason said simply. Chris let out a small breath, then, finally, nodded. Mason turned to Brianna now. And you? She tensed slightly. I don't know what you're offering. I'm giving you a raise, Mason said plainly. And I'm setting up a bonus system for the entire staff, so that the people who keep this place running, the people who actually care, get rewarded for it. Brianna's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining with something dangerously close to tears. But this time they weren't out of frustration or exhaustion. Mason smiled slightly. "That work for you?" She nodded quickly, still covering her mouth as she tried to compose herself. "Good," Mason said, pushing back from the table and standing. "Then let's get to work." As he walked away, he could feel it in the air behind him, a shift, a change, a spark that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long time, the Harvest Grill in Brookhaven felt like a place worth working for again. And Mason. He wasn't going anywhere until it stayed that way. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Mason didn't just make promises, he followed through. He spent every morning at the Brookhaven Harvest Grill, observing, listening, stepping in where needed. He worked the floor during rush hours, ran food to tables when the kitchen was backed up, even spent a morning flipping pancakes on the grill just to see what kind of pressure Chris was dealing with firsthand. The employees, hesitant at first, quickly realized this wasn't just some corporate stunt. The CEO of the entire company was there, in the trenches with them, proving that his words weren't empty. The first major change was staffing. Within a week, Mason had personally approved 3 new hires, filling the gaps that had left Brianna and the rest of the team drowning for months. The difference was immediate. The restaurant breathed again, no more frantic, exhausted workers pushing through double shifts without relief, no more customers waiting endlessly for their food. The atmosphere lightened. The employees moved with purpose, not panic. Chris took to his new role as assistant manager with a quiet but steady confidence. At first he had been wary, unsure if he could handle leadership, unsure if he even wanted it, after what he had seen under Anthony's rule. But Mason kept an eye on him, nudging him in the right direction, giving him real responsibility without micromanaging. And the more Chris realized he didn't have to lead through fear, the more he stepped up. He learned to delegate, to support the team, to set a different kind of tone, one built on trust instead of intimidation. Brianna flourished too. She no longer had to brace herself for a shift, no longer had to push through exhaustion just to survive the day. When Mason introduced the new bonus system, she had tears in her eyes, not out of sadness this time, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt valued. She worked just as hard as before, but now there was lightness in her movements, a real smile in her greetings. Customers noticed. Tips increased. The energy in the diner shifted. And then came the final step, finding the right manager. Mason didn't rush the decision. He vetted candidates carefully, looking not just for experience but for the right kind of leadership. He needed someone who understood this wasn't just about running numbers and keeping the grill hot. This was about people, about building a team, not breaking one. That's how he found Denise Holloway. Denise had been managing restaurants for over a decade, but what set her apart was how she spoke about her teams. During the interview, she didn't list numbers or percentages. She talked about her people, about how a strong team made everything better. She had an easy authority, a natural presence that made people want to follow her, not fear her. And when Mason brought her in for a test run, he knew within a single shift that she was the right choice. When Mason gathered the team to introduce her officially, he kept it simple. "This is Denise," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet dining room. "She's your new manager, and I trust her to keep this place running the way it should be." Denise smiled, looking around at the familiar faces. "I know things have been rough," she said, her voice steady but warm. "That changes today. You give me your best, and I promise I'll give you mine." There was a beat of silence. Then Brianna nodded. Chris did too. And just like that, the last piece fell into place. With Denise in charge, with Chris as her right hand, with a fully staffed and rejuvenated team, the Brookhaven Harvest Grill wasn't just functioning again, it was thriving. Mason knew his work here was done. The morning he was set to leave, he sat in his usual booth near the window, drinking his coffee, as the diner hummed with new energy. The door chimed every few minutes as customers came and went, laughter and conversation filling the space. It felt different now, lighter, warmer. It felt like the kind of place he had always envisioned when he started this company. Brianna walked over, her notepad tucked under one arm, a small smile on her face. "So, today's your last day?" she asked. Mason nodded, setting his coffee down. "Yeah, time for me to get back to the rest of the company." She hesitated, then glanced around the diner, as if seeing it through new eyes. "It's different now," she said softly. "Feels right." Mason smiled. "That's the goal." She bit her lip, then before she could second-guess it, she reached out and gave his shoulder a quick squeeze. "Thanks," she said. "For everything." He patted her hand once, then leaned back. "Just promise me one thing." She tilted her head. "What's that?" "Take care of this place," he said, his voice quieter now but firm. "It's yours as much as it's mine." Bryana exhaled, her smile growing. "I will." Chris passed by, giving Mason a nod. Denise caught his eye from across the room and grinned before getting back to work. Mason took one last look around, letting the moment settle, letting it sink in. Then, satisfied, he stood, left a generous tip on the table, and walked out the door, knowing that this time, when he looked back, he wouldn't have to worry. Because things had finally changed. And he wouldn't let them go back. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.